Hey everybody, I'm Alex Dagan. Nice to be here. Thank you all for coming and listening. I was telling everyone that my talk today was somewhere between the men's urinals. This is a little bit better than what I think. So we know this particular bug has really made our lives horrible for the last 3 years. And not just our lives, but fundamentally development. We know that there's 500 million people who had COVID, and that's probably a gross underestimate. We know global deaths, again, were 6 million, and in the United States, we're over 1 million deaths within it. But we also know that close to 75 million people were pushed back into extreme poverty, 80 million more malnourished, and the loss of remittances. So if we are thinking about the biggest issues in development, preventing the next pandemic has to be part of that. And we know that there's pretty good certainty that this was created within a wet lab, within a wet market in Wuhan, particularly moving a pathogen that was resident in horseshoe bats, moving to pangolins, and then those pangolins in Wuhan. But this is not unusual. We know that most of the recent pathogens, including many coronaviruses, are shared between humans, domestic animals, and wildlife. And in fact, COVID-19 isn't the exception. 3/4 of pathogens emerging now are zoonotic. There's new pathogens emerging at the rate of 1 a year, but even more importantly, the rate of spread due to globalization and the pathogens themselves are increasing. HIV took 56 years to reach the United States. Ebola took 4 months in 2014. SARS-CoV-2 took 2 months to reach the US in 2020. And these pathogens are not just limited to humans, but they're wiping out wildlife, and they are affecting our agriculture. This is kind of the critical message up front of this talk. It is really great to have new vaccines. It is really great to invest in healthcare capacity. But what we actually need to do is to prevent these pathogens from spilling over in the first place. This is not a new idea. When I was on the policy planning staff at the Department of State in 2005, this was literally the message that I wrote to Secretary Condoleezza Rice at that time, and was told it was not an important issue. 2020, I sent it back to the head of policy planning, Stephen Krasner, to remind him of that idea. What's even worse, it is human behavior that is selecting for rapid changes in pathogen biology through habitat fragmentation, through wildlife change, trade, through climate shifts, and through environmental pollution. And we're doing it through a variety of different ways, through ingestion of wildlife, through wildlife trade and traditional medicine, through animal husbandry. Ebola was thought to result of bushmeat hunting from bats and non-human primates. HIV was supposed to be through bushmeat hunting of chimpanzees. MERS is through animal husbandry of camels. It's not surprising that we found pangolins at the centerpiece of COVID. Pangolins is the #1 traded species in the world. This thing that looks, it's really cute. It may not look cute, but it's really cute. It runs on its hind legs. It has tiny little arms. It sort of looks like a T-Rex that has mated with an armadillo. But it is 20% of what is traded globally because of the medicinal properties of its scales. It's not surprising that we have monkeypox. I was working at the Department of State for the first monkeypox epidemic. That was because we had brought in this species, the Gambian pouch rat. It was placed next to prairie dogs. The prairie dogs passed to individuals who had that pet. What is interesting about monkeypox now is it's an STI. It's passing through sex among men. We also have what is called inadvertent wildlife trade. So invasive species, that is in part because of our globalization. Invasives can be vectors for new introduction of pathogens into novel regions or habitats. And we have environmental degradation. I spent years working in Madagascar as a lemur biologist, as some of you guys know. And one of the things we found was that lemurs and fragments get malaria, which they do not get in the intact habitats. They also have higher parasite loads. what we see when we start degrading things like tropical forests is that species diversity is actually maintaining the reservoirs at lower capacity because there are more species. When you eliminate that species diversity, you have something called competitive release, which is well known in ecology. The lack of a regulatory agent, the lack of an apex predator can also cause a release. And we see that with deer. If you're wondering why Lyme disease is spreading across the United States, it is the absence of predators like wolves in the United States that used to restrict deer. In fact, our vegetation would look fundamentally different if wolves were there. And then changes in landscape geometry, so edge effects that you have that allow for spillover because you're literally putting wildlife in conjunction with domestic animals, and things like having rice paddies around those habitats in Madagascar support vectors coming about. Nipah is a great example. You may have remembered the Nipah virus, which is another coronavirus. It was fires in Indonesia plus deforestation that drove fruit bats into agricultural fields and date palms. When the date palms were collected, that passed to humans. When the bats also nested over fruit trees, because they're fruit bats, over pig pens, it passed to the pigs. Humans ate the pigs, it then passed to humans. Both of those things resulted in an outbreak that covered almost much of the Indian Ocean and Indo-Pacific. And we know that the Romans knew that climate change had a huge impact on the spread of diseases. It can expand the range of pathogens. It can expand the amount of time that a biting agent like a mosquito is active. So the more bites can lead to greater transmissibility. It can actually change the range of predators or competitors that might limit the spread of disease. It can change the weather patterns that lead to more rain or drought and fire. Fire is what drove the bats in Nipah as well. And then we got this thing called spillover. And this is, I think, one of the most terrifying things. This is really research that was done in December of this year. And it is the fact, these are called reverse zoonotic events. So 650 mammal species now get COVID. The belief that Omicron, which affected the United States, it actually was evolved within rodent species and then passed back to humans. So this idea of animals passing to humans, humans now passing to animals, and that wildlife actually passing back and incubating and developing the mutations are what we're trying to see. 40%, I'm sure you guys saw this, 40% of the deer tested in Michigan were found affected with COVID-19. In New York, it was 80% of the deer had Omicron. More fundamentally, it is our misuse of nature that has undermined our planetary health. And this is our demand for protein, for cooling, for plastics, for fiber, and materials that has driven it. And just some examples from areas that Conservation X Labs works on, food and feed. We know that it'll be 9.7, just got upgraded to 9.8 billion by 2050, is 70% more food. 70% more food is about 1 billion hectares of additional cultivated land that we know. The United States is 950 million hectares. So that means we will need to clear the Congo Basin and the Amazon. That will be opportunities for pathogen spread. We also know that billions of people are moving into middle class, and one of the things that they want is to eat more protein. And it takes 70% of the soybean in the United States is actually grown to feed these individuals. And when that food comes along with doubling the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the water, and the pesticides that we use, those all have effects. Plus the industrialization of agriculture is a great place for disease spread, like avian influenza. Our EV, our transition to electronic vehicles, our transition to a tech economy can also drive this. This is a picture of a place we're working right now in the Amazon, in Madre de Dios. This place is called La Pampa. So in 3 years, 30,000 miners, these are artisanal miners. You might think that sounds like Etsy miners. They're actually individual miners, right? This is not mechanistic mining and large-scale corporate mining. 30,000 miners cleared 15,000 hectares in 3 years. What's extraordinary is that landscape's now 1/3 water that's contaminated with mercury. It's the largest source of mercury pollution in the world. This is the mercury that gets into your fish, right, when you think about it. It's driven by us. It's driven by the products that we're buying in the biggest companies in the world in terms of things. And the same thing is true for things like cobalt and tantalum. Cobalt's used in the batteries in our electric cars. Tantalum is used in all the capacitors that we use within our electronics. And mercury exposure in wildlife is linked with a weaker immune response, and it's also having huge significant neurological impacts on surrounding communities. And let's talk about clothing. We actually have a session that's going on in the big room. Sort of looks like, 3 people go in for a talk, 1 comes out. But think about the clothing. You are wearing oil and gas on your body. And we know about the problem of microplastics, but we may not know that 35% of microplastics are microfibers. And they're actually given by the shedding on your plastic. Even if you're wearing natural fibers, more likely if it has any kind of elasticity is because there are plastics in it. Again, plastics are oil and gas, right? But the other thing is that it is everywhere. It is precipitating microplastics and microfibers in the Arctic and the Antarctic. It is in the bottom of the Marianas Trench. It is in 94% of US tap water. It is in our table salt. And it is now in our blood as of a month ago in a scientific study that is there. What's really interesting now is that the microplastics are also pathogen carriers. They're now increasingly, when they start looking at these microplastics, they find that they are platforms for pathogens to get in. So we don't think of the issue of our clothing and sustainable fashion and fast fashion as a global health issue, but it is. So how do we fix this? One is the White House has come up with a new center for analytics to forecast the next pandemic. And we need to build on that, targeted predictions to understand how changing a landscape, how our global health interventions, our development interventions affect wildlife and affect the risk of spillover. But we also need things like weather stations in the field, and we need to know what to do. How do we use conservation as a global health tool? How do we think about food security within this? We created, one of the things Conservation X Labs created is Thylacine Biosciences. And one of the things we wanted to do is just recognize that if you actually want to be able to understand where spillover happens, you have to take diagnostics and biosurveillance out of here and into here. So we created a tool that is handheld, that is battery powered, that is useful for anyone, including my 6-year-old son, to be able to use in the field. We're going for CLIA waiver. It has the specificity and sensitivity of a PCR test, but it has the cost, ease of use, and speed of a lateral flow test. But it works for anything. We can give any pathogen, pest, or species a diagnostic test now and solve this problem of neglected diagnostics. It's super rugged and portable. We bury it in sand, we splash it, we submerge it, we use it in high humidity. It's very low cost. And we want to be able to use this for being able to understand where spillover happens, understand what happens in our supply chains, understand what happens in industrial agriculture, and think about also how we understand what's happening with species due to climate change. One of the ways we make this work is by democratizing how we use such technology. The problem is big pharma will only focus on diagnostics for the most profitable of pathogens. We think there's another model borrowed from the PlayStation. How do we develop the equivalent of a software development kit, right, that you need to get on the App Store or get on your Apple devices or Android devices for molecular science? And how do we then automate the process of taking millions of lab-based tests and allowing people to use it in point of care? And we're partnering with some of the best universities around the world to be able to do that. This is the last one. I'm going to go way over time, but I'm the last speaker, so it's okay, and we'll get a drink afterwards. But this is a thought. I spent, it's not really the last one, but don't tell her. I spent a lot of time, as some of you guys know, helped set up the first national park in Afghanistan, wrote a book called The Snow Leopard Project, and would do this, take camera trap photos of snow leopards. The problem with camera traps, they're passive recording devices, is that you have to go into those areas to check them. You don't know what's on there. It was like old school photography. You take the pictures. It was a big surprise when you develop them and you get the images back. But we realized that we could actually take those passive devices and turn them into real-time, real world actionable intelligence, that we could take machine learning, machine vision, and plug into the existing million or so camera traps around the world and make them smarter. And so we automate the processing of data and we make AI technology. No one should have to learn machine learning to be able to use these tools, but that's frequently what we ask people to do in conservation technology. We have a model marketplace where people can, essentially a gen bank where people can contribute models. We can create custom models for people, and we plug in through the one thing that every camera trap in the world has in common, which is the memory cards. And so it's standard, and we do it not in the cloud, but localized because connectivity is an issue. So we can identify species of interest. When the snow leopard walks by, I get that picture of a snow leopard. Sometimes you can go through 3,000 images and only get one. When we see a disease, we can find that. When we see a poacher, we can find that. And when we see a behavior, we can spot it. And this is, I don't know if this is going to work, but this is work we're doing in the Congo. Green is our algorithm that's describing the behavior of these gorillas automatically. White is the primatologist describing the same behaviors. And as you can see, it's literally automating the ability for us to do what I used to do for my PhD and spend 3 years in Madagascar doing and getting to it. Why is this interesting is we can do the same thing around disease. These are Florida panthers. Florida panthers, right, are what got me into conservation. They were down to 50-something individuals. When you get that small, you have something called a small population problem, right? Where your population is so small that a series of car accidents or all the cats are born male or female can be enough to drive them to extinction. In this case, they have a neurological disease. And if you just look, you can pick it up by them walking. And the algorithm can actually pick up that one of the 3 cubs of that mom cat has that neurological disease. And we can do this with chronic wasting disease, which is mad cow. It's a prion-based disease that we have spreading in the United States. We can think of conservation and food security as global health strategies. We can start integrating principles of conservation like ecology, evolution, and behavior in our understanding of global health. And we can ultimately do what some of these individuals are calling for in some of the other sessions, like Bruce Friedrich, who leads the Global Food Institute. Let's actually think about how we replace food, feed, fiber, and materials and build economies in the developing world that are not based on degradation and extraction, but based on regeneration and opportunity. We shouldn't be building industries of the past when we can build them in the future. This is the last slide. This is the picture, if you guys haven't seen it, of the first one that President Biden showed yesterday of the Webb telescope. There's even better ones today. Check them out, right? And the reason I show this and the reason I show pictures of the fact that we flew a drone on Mars is if we have the capability, Susan's laughing, if we have the capability of being able to do this, we can solve these problems. Planetary health requires us to think about new pathways that we can build for the future. We shouldn't be building these economies of the past. And we can think about global health, development, food security, climate change, conservation in entirely new ways. Thank you very much.